Today's webinar, Teaching and Learning in a Concept-Based Nursing Curriculum, is hosted by author and expert Donna Ignatavicius.
Thank you, Jen. Good morning, everybody. Most of you probably know me as Iggy. You probably know me because of my other writings I've done, including being a primary author of the leading med-surg textbook. But my other life, besides being an author, is that I've been a nurse educator for many years, and someone just told me that after 30, you don't have to say how many, so I'll just say I have over 30 years of experience as a nurse educator, primarily teaching in pre-licensure nursing programs, associate degree, baccalaureate, as well as post-licensure. In a few cases, I taught in several RN to BSN programs, as well as guest lectured in graduate programs. What I've been doing in addition to writing and being a nurse educator is currently I'm a full-time and leading academic nursing education consultant, and my specialty areas are curriculum development, instruction, and evaluation. And I'm sure that some of you may have attended some of my conferences. I have done this work in all 50 states, I'm pleased to say, and most recently have added Canada to my repertoire. Canada, as you may or may not know, has had to, the graduates from Canada have had to take the NCLEX exam for the last couple of years. So they are anxious to learn more about curriculum, about being concept-based. In addition, I finally got around to taking that test for Certified Nurse Educator, and so I took it very recently, last year, and passed it, got my CNE credential. And since 2007, I've been a fellow of the Academy of Nursing Education. In fact, I was a charter member inducted in that year. And if you're not familiar with that organization, it's a great organization for recognizing nurse educators who have contributed nationally to nursing education, who've had an influence on nursing education and how it goes forward. So enough about me. Let's look at some information about the book. So you'll see on this slide that this is a very practical how-to approach book, because it even says that in the subtitle, a how-to best practice approach. I thought that was important for people who are adopting the book or who are purchasing the book, so that they know that this is not going to be a high-level theoretical book. It is certainly based on theory, and it is based on research. However, it is a very practical, read it today, use it tomorrow. In helping it be that way, there are multiple tools and tips and strategies that reflect best practices for nursing concept-based curriculum. Certainly, those practices and tools are going to be geared more to pre-licensure, because we know there are more pre-licensure programs that are concept-based or who use conceptual teaching and learning as a basis than graduate programs. However, do know if you're teaching in a graduate program, or if you're thinking about having your graduate program become concept-based, there is information in this text that talks about application to graduate level curricula where indicated are included. Also Canadian, I don't know if we have any Canadian attendees today. Canada is getting into the concept-based curriculum model. And so they're doing that certainly because the NCLEX is becoming more conceptual and less focused on medical diagnoses. So there are Canadian inclusions, particularly where differences exist. Recently, when I was in Canada, a Canadian educator said to me, the body is the body, so we don't differ there. But where we differ is concepts in professional nursing. So I've included some information about relational practice, which is a big difference in Canada compared to the U.S. So there is a discussion and references for relational practice, for example, as a professional nurse in that state. You should also know that the content of this book is based on my experiences throughout the country and Canada, as well as a solid support by numerous resources. Every chapter has many references. Some are websites, some is research, where research is available. Unfortunately, in nursing at this moment, we don't have a large-scale research that we can say concept-based absolutely is the way to go. But we know there's a lot of great outcome data coming out about the importance of going conceptual, because certainly K through 12 has gone that way, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. So let's get in on the next slide to looking how the book is laid out. The book is divided into 3 major parts, and they're very easily named, Part 1, 2, and 3. Part 1 is an introduction to concept-based curriculum and conceptual learning. I have conceptualized the book to differentiate between the concept-based curriculum and conceptual learning. Concept-based curriculum I see as the structure. It's how we put the program together, the curriculum together, the courses together. But conceptual learning is the process of how you help students learn conceptually, which of course, as you know, if you've read anything about concept-based curriculum and conceptual learning, you'll know that its advantage is that students can develop deep learning, not that superficial memorize and dump. They also can learn more about critical thinking and its newer term now, clinical judgment and clinical reasoning, and that's the terminology that I use throughout the book for a number of reasons, which I'll go into in a little bit. Chapter 1 begins with simply an introduction to curriculum. What's curriculum? What's nursing curriculum? What are the average or usual components of a nursing curriculum, knowing that they vary a bit from state to state and they vary a bit in Canada, but for the most part discussing everything from philosophy and mission through course development. So it's a very brief review for anybody who doesn't really know a lot, particularly new faculty who might not know a lot about curricular development. Chapter 2 introduces the reader to conceptual learning so that we can understand why this movement for conceptual teaching and learning is occurring. And it talks a lot about and references a lot of the work of Lynn Erickson. If you're not familiar with Lynn Erickson's work, Erickson is the founder, I guess you would say, of K through 12 concept-based curricula. And in fact, that is a movement both in this country and Canada to move K through 12 education to concept. And the reason why that happens, of course, is because there's too much knowledge. The internet is exploding, it's exponentially increasing with its knowledge banks, and so we can't teach everything. So we therefore have to teach these big mental images and pictures and ideas so that students can then apply them in a variety of contexts. So that is why people are moving to concept-based curriculum, particularly related in nursing to nursing concepts. So that chapter 2, talks quite a bit about that movement. And our students, as they come to us as new graduates from high school in the next few years, are going to expect us to teach conceptually. I oftentimes use the analogy for people who are a little not sure about concept-based curriculum. I often use the analogy, well, how do we teach pharmacology? We can't teach every drug. We teach it by classification. And those are, if you want to say, meta concepts. And then under that, the prototypes. So we don't teach every drug under each classification. So that's what concept-based is really all about. We can't teach all knowledge. Students can't learn all knowledge, but they learn to be resourceful. Chapter 3 talks about a CBC model, how to develop a program that's concept-based. In part 2, there's 6 chapters, and there are 6 chapters in part 2. And this is really the nuts and bolts of the book. This is where very specific strategies, tools are outlined. So there's a great discussion about case studies and how you use case studies. There is a great discussion about concept mapping and how it's really supposed to be used in a concept-based curriculum, not necessarily the way that some faculty might be using it today. There's information about multiple settings, so that how do you teach conceptually in the clinical arena? How do you teach clinically in lab and simulation? Conceptually in lab and simulation. How do you teach conceptually in the classroom or online? So all those educational settings are included in part 2. In part 3, I think I did something a little bit different than perhaps other literature in that there hasn't been a lot written about how do you evaluate learning in a concept-based curriculum, and then how do you evaluate if your program is successful. So chapters 10 and 11 talk about evaluating learning in the classroom, online, and clinical settings. And then finally, Chapter 12 talks about program evaluation, using your program evaluation plan to capture the effectiveness of how well one has met their outcomes in the concept-based curriculum. What our graduates look like, are they able to be even better nurses and think? And that's really what I see and what I have emphasized in my book is the purpose of conceptual-based learning is we must help students achieve critical thinking, achieve deep learning, and be better clinical reasoners using clinical judgments to make safe decisions for our patients and families and communities. On the next slide, again, it just reminds you that we are looking at a book that is focusing on conceptual teaching and learning in multiple settings, and by that I mean educational settings, which I already mentioned. I also want to tell you that Chapter 3 is the chapter that is devoted to my unique 12-step model for CBC development. So even if you have a curriculum that you think is working, or maybe perhaps it's not working and you're struggling, you might go back to look at this chapter and say, well, where did we go wrong? Or if you're a graduate faculty and you're teaching graduate students about concept-based curriculum because they want to be educators and you're in the education track, or a postmaster certificate in nursing education, you're going to want to use this book so they really understand how one goes about developing a CBC. I find in my work that a lot of new faculty don't even know the components of all the curricular elements that are necessary. They don't really know how to get started, and they don't always even recognize that that's part of their job as a faculty member. So the pedagogies that I've used are varied, actually. Every chapter begins with just a short list of chapter learning outcomes, and I think that's really helpful so that you know what you can expect in that chapter. Examples of tools within the text. By tools, I mean boxed features that highlight the priorities. We have a feature called Remember This, and those are the reminders of how important some of the more important than others as some of the text. There's also tables, and there's also end of chapter key points. We also have more tools in the appendices. There are 5 or 6 appendices that actually have templates that you can just use in your own work as either a faculty member developing curriculum, or if you're in a graduate program and you're faculty teaching students how to develop this curriculum. There's also a glossary. So bolded terms, the terms that are in the glossary are bolded within the text, and then they're defined yet again in the glossary. So if they're reading a chapter where the definition has already been presented in a previous chapter or another chapter, and they don't recall what that particular term is, they can simply look at the glossary, and that is within the book. So on the next slide, and I've actually sort of hinted at this as well, we have a two-pronged approach in looking at the target audience. Originally, when I was thinking about the book, I was thinking about those faculty who were just asking me for resources, and so I started thinking about it for nursing faculty. But then as I talk with graduate faculty, and I've been asking graduate faculty who are teaching in education tracks or postmaster's nursing education certificate programs, I ask them how much time do they spend in their curriculum courses talking with students about developing concept-based, or what concept-based is all about, or what conceptual learning is all about. I found that they're spending very little time. I recall one graduate faculty saying to me that out of her curriculum course that she teaches in the graduate level, she spends 30 minutes on concept-based curriculum, and did I think that was enough? Well, no, it's not enough. Students really do need to understand, graduate students entering education really, truly need to know more about curriculum, and in particular, concept-based curriculum, because it's not a fad, it's not going away, and it's the basis of K through 12 education. I've been in several states recently where their whole state program is being based around 2 things. One is conceptual learning, and the other is mastery learning, which I talk a little bit about in the book as well. So for graduate students, this is going to be a great resource for them, and it's the only book really that they need for this concept-based curriculum. For nursing faculty, even if you already have a concept-based curriculum and you're implementing it, you may want to evaluate it. I hope you are continually evaluating it. So there are a lot of tips for both pre-licensure and post-licensure programs. So you might want to use this textbook even if you already have, or this book even if you have a curriculum that you think is concept-based. I'm finding that faculty sometimes struggle with this whole area because you don't just wake up tomorrow and become a conceptual teacher, and students just don't wake up tomorrow and become conceptual learners. So there's a lot of good nuggets in here for you. So on the next slide, we'll say, well, why do we need this book? Well, because there's not much out there. There are some articles that attack or address certain areas, but there's really only one other book. It's a little smaller, and it is very theoretical. About, I would say, 2/3 of it really talk about the theory of concept-based, which is great because we need to know why we are trying to push the whole conceptual learning movement in nursing. Certainly other health professions are already there, by the way. Medicine has already gone conceptual in many schools and other professions as well in the healthcare world. So in that book that is available, there's only about 1/3 of the book really talks about the tools and some examples in that last section. And it's not terribly user-friendly, direct to read sort of a textbook. It's a little heavy to wade through. So that's why I really felt we needed another book that was richer and more practical how-to. And as I said before, I am frequently asked, you know, what are the resources? Where can we go? So that's why I did it. So on the next slide, you'll see sort of a summary of what the text benefits are to graduate students, because I do believe that graduate students need this book. There's some great curriculum nursing textbooks out there. Keating is one, and a couple of others that some of you might be using if you're teaching in a graduate level program. But I think there isn't really any textbook really that's as useful as this one for graduate students. And I wouldn't say this should be recommended. I think it should be required. And why? Because right now, in my estimation and in the estimation of the literature, over half of pre-licensure nursing programs are concept-based. So this isn't just a few people dabbing in it. This is a big deal. We have about another 25% who are actively developing it. That's just my best guess based on the calls I get, the questions I get, and the places I've gone around the country and Canada. And I think the other 25%, frankly, are sort of waiting to see how it all turns out. But they realize that students need to know how to, if they're going to be hired by a school, they need to know how to function and teach conceptually and help students learn conceptually in a concept-based curriculum. The other thing that's a challenge is that every one of these programs are different. There's not one model that everybody is using. I think a lot of us go to some of the models that are out there, but there's a lot of what I would call modified models out there. So I have not subscribed to any person's model or any one model. Rather, I've given you alternatives. I said, you know, some people do this, some people do that. This is what everybody seems to be doing, and it's really your own. You know, faculty direct curriculum based on your preferences, best practices, resources that you have, your student population, and what part of the country or Canada you're in. So I think it's important that you keep in mind that you have flexibility when you develop this program, when you develop a concept-based curriculum. And that's what students need to know as graduate students. They need to know that there's not just one way, and that's what I've presented, where the other book that is available does sort of present this is the way to do it. And I'm much more flexible in my discussions based on my experience and the literature. So graduate students do need to learn how to teach in a CBC. And importantly as well, how do you evaluate that learning? So again, because we have those 3 chapters, or I have those 3 chapters at the end of the book about evaluating conceptual learning and evaluating the effectiveness of a CBC, I think that's really crucial. So on the next slide sort of summarizes how is this book different. I think it's very easy to read. I certainly, when I'm learning something new, and I'm sure you would appreciate this as well, you want to know the theoretical base, you want to know the research base, but you also want to be able to understand what you're reading. So it's very user-friendly, and that direct style, in some cases I use second person. I'm talking to you as the instructor or the student, and it's well supported by the literature. I do want to emphasize that to you again, that we truly have best practice and evidence base where the evidence is available, and I certainly have to say that. We also included, because of the multiple settings, you'll see on the slide, you'll see Chapter 7, which is just based on concept-based online learning. So we have tried to include all the educational settings. There are many examples I mentioned before of tools, but I also want to mention about templates. One of the things we know is that when you go to introduce a concept, we want to have some standardization in how to introduce the concept. We want a template. So I've provided in an appendix a complete concept analysis presentation for a health and illness concept. I believe I use mobility, and then also a professional nursing and healthcare concept, which I use clinical judgment. Clinical judgment is becoming even more important these days because the NCLEX is now going to begin testing a new format item in this month, actually, on measuring clinical judgment using different formats, unfolding case studies and other formats. So we're going to see a very different NCLEX, I believe, in the next couple of years once they get all their data in for validity and reliability. On the next slide, you're going to love this book. It's the only resource you need, whether you're a faculty member teaching in a concept-based curriculum, or you're a faculty member thinking about maybe doing, or a faculty thinking about going forward. You need this resource in your educational library, in your program, because no matter where you are in the concept-based world, developing, implementing, or evaluating a current one, this would be a book that would be very useful for you. It's also the only resource that graduate students need to be prepared to teach in a CBC. Graduate students on the next slide will love this because everything is right there. Multiple references are there, many studies are there, current studies, it's very current. And when, by the way, in the reference list of each chapter, if there is a reference that's classic, it's older, but it's classic, I've denoted that with an asterisk, so that they'll know that this is put in here for a reason. For example, Lynn Erickson's work, much of that was done between 2002 and 2010, and so some of that older work is still very classic and nobody has replicated that, so I have simply put an asterisk by it to show you that I know it's older, but it is a classic. Certainly it's reasonably priced. It's a small paperback, trim size, it's very reasonably priced. And I think that's also very useful for graduate students or any students who are constantly struggling with pricing. So the ways to use this book in summary, and I think my last slide that I'm going to talk about, is a required book. I really want to emphasize to you the need for requiring the book, not just as a supplemental recommended, but required, because there isn't another one like it. I think it can, you also want to use one of your main curriculum books about general traditional curriculum, but I've also in this book really differentiated the traditional curriculum from the concept-based curriculum. Also for faculty, again, a resource for you. So I'm going to turn this back over to Jen, who's going to give you a little bit more information about how you get this book. I also will be taking questions that I'll be glad to answer. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Donna, for that comprehensive overview of both the text and some tips about including the concept-based curriculum in one's course. So just a couple of URLs that I wanted to share with you. The text will publish on September 1st, so that's coming up in just a few short months. If you would like to save 25% on your purchase, I encourage you to use the code CBC25, and you can visit go.jblearning.com/CBNC. And if you're considering adopting this for your course, we encourage you to reach out to your sales rep, and you can talk to them about the adoption possibilities there. A copy of this presentation is also available on the product catalog page. And if you're interested in sharing this with a colleague of yours, we invite you to our YouTube channel. That can be found at go.jblearning.com/YouTubeCBC. That will be the link to this precise recording. And we do have just a few questions that have come in via Q&A on the chat, and if that's something that you'd like to do, you can message me, Jennifer Scherzay, the host, directly. So one of the questions, Donna, that came up is from an instructor. Her name is Catherine. She's asking for the difference between concept-based and competency-based curriculum.
Yes, and actually I talk about that in the book. So truly, most programs I've worked with have really a blend, because concepts, by definition, are the ideas and images that help us organize our curriculum. But the competencies are those outcomes, those competencies that we want our graduates to demonstrate using the concepts. So if we say, for example, clinical judgment, excuse me, that clinical judgment is a professional nursing concept, well, that's great, this is what it is, this is how we use it, but what are the competencies associated with that? So those would become really, most people who do concept-based don't really just do concept-based, they blend competencies with it. So that is how I present it in the book.
Thanks, Donna. Another question, we have a couple more questions that have actually come in. Another instructor asks, are we putting our students at a disadvantage when the school says it's using a concept-based curriculum but really hasn't changed the way the course is structured?
I would say then the school is not advertising completely truthfully, and I don't mean that to be, ugly, but if we say we have a concept-based curriculum, we should be able to see it both organizationally and structure. And if I sat in on a classroom or online or clinical, I should see conceptual learning and teaching going on. And I have done that, by the way, where programs have said they're concept-based, and I sat in on the program and I did not see that happening at all. I sat in on classes. I didn't see anything any differently than we've been doing for a zillion years. So we don't want to just talk the talk, we want to walk the talk. I don't think the students are at a disadvantage per se, but I think anybody's at a disadvantage who's trying to memorize, any student who's trying to memorize a lot of content and trying to figure out what to do with it and then dumping it on a test, hopefully passing the test. But then what happens at NCLEX time is that they fail because they really don't. And even if they pass, it's just minimal competency. What we're really seeing is a crisis in competency and I would refer you to a great article of January of this year, January, February, in the NLN Perspectives in Nursing Education. There's a research article there that looked at 5,000 new graduates, and only 23%, I believe that's the number, demonstrated competence in clinical judgment. So we're doing something wrong in our traditional ways, and we've got to get to thinking and thinking conceptually.
Thank you, Donna. A couple other questions that have come in. Are there any clinical resources in the text or any information on how you can weave in clinical experiences into a concept-based curriculum?
Absolutely. There is an entire chapter, quite lengthy, on what a clinical day looks like, ways to connect theory and clinical. Remember Benner's work of 2010, where she and her colleagues found in that national study of nursing education in the U.S. that students do not see the relationship between theory or the didactic, the knowledge piece, and the clinical piece. And so I have talked about how to pull those together and the absolute necessity to do so, and then a chapter on how you evaluate clinical learning. So I think you'll find lots of really great nuggets in those chapters. I actually have two questions that came up on my screen.
Go ahead.
One was, can I recommend any textbooks for the students? this is becoming an interesting challenge, I think, around the country, is how do we present when we have all of these differences among concept-based curricula to come up with one textbook. Another company does have a textbook that they consider concept-based, but it's not widely used because it's missing a lot of really important content. At least that's what I'm told. I'm not dissing anybody. I'm just what I'm being told by faculty. So I think what we're going to see is we're not going to see comprehensive concept-based books across the lifespan. I think we're going to continue to see for the next few years anyway, med-surg books, pediatric books, OB books, mental health books, community health books, that will go more conceptual in their approach. So it really won't be a concept-based book for your whole curriculum, but rather students will have to purchase several books, but the books will be presented more conceptually so that not every disease or disorder or issue in professional nursing is brought up. So that's where I see it's going, and I'm already beginning to see books come out to do that.
Great. I think there was another one. I'm not sure if we answered this question, but I'll just throw it out there anyway. Someone is saying that they're using a modified competency-based curriculum and is asking if you've heard of this.
I think I have the same question that I'm seeing, a modified competency concept-based. So yes, a modified is absolutely what I'm seeing most programs actually use. If we look at the original model that came out of Jean Giddens' work at the University of New Mexico, where I was living at the time. And I worked with her, to learn more about that, and she and I have had a lot of conversations. She has what I'm calling a purist model because it's her model, and she has the references and resources that she uses, and she's published on that. But I find that most programs do not use everything that's in that model. They pick and choose what works for them, and that's what makes it modified. So I am actually a proponent of a modified curriculum because that curriculum that was developed by Dr. Giddens and her colleagues, it really wasn't research-based per se, although certainly they used common issues and needs that we would see in multiple literature sources. I'm not saying that, but what I am saying is that there's 57 or 58 concepts. Most programs are using less than that. There are a couple programs using more than that, but most people are using less because if you get very unwieldy and circular and everything is related to everything else, and students can get very confused. So I really recommend, in my work as a consultant, I've done a lot of modified curricula, and I talk a lot about that in the book and how to go about that.
Thank you. I see another question, Donna, that has come in asking, do you recommend the purchase of one large textbook or many different textbooks when delivering the concept-based curriculum?
Well, since I haven't found one large textbook that I really like, that I think really does it, I would have to say at this moment, going with several textbooks that present the content more conceptually, identifying exemplars, and really being set up on selected concepts. Right now, that's where we are. And I think publishers are hesitant, and this has been my experience around the country. I think publishers are hesitant to create books that are concept-based, but rather they have electronic resources where you can link up on their electronic platform, you can link up the concepts with content in any book. And that's why I think they're not putting the money into moving towards large textbooks that hopefully are getting smaller, by the way. If we're really conceptual, textbooks should be getting smaller. And we have to recognize that's important.
Thanks, Donna. It doesn't appear that we have any additional questions. I think that those were great. Thanks, everyone, for participating. And I want to extend a really special thank you to Donna for taking time to talk about her textbook as well as this new concept that's of interest to faculty. Donna, I don't know if you have just a few additional things that you'd like to say to participants before we close out.
I would say sometimes when we're learning something new and we're trying to figure out this movement happening in the country right now, I think sometimes there's a lot of misinformation that's flooded out there. There are some people who are very purist and they'll tell you there's only one way. And I would like to reiterate that there are multiple ways to do it. And if you just want to email me a question, you know, a lot of times people just say, hey, you know what, I didn't really want to do it on the webinar, but can I text you or email you? All my information is available on my website. So if you want to contact me and just ask me questions later as you think about this, or you're just not sure about the book, I can give you even more information if that would help you. So I'm available to you. I'm not a distant author. I'm a very approachable direct access person. Thank you so much.